So let's take a look at how we can select an object, duplicate it, move it, rotate, scale it, navigate it, move it between layers, and kind of like get comfortable with how to navigate in 3D space in Blender. With the left mouse button, you can click on an object, and then if you want to make a copy, you can press Shift D, or you could go to the Object menu, and here you see Shift D. There's also a duplicate link. You see it says Alt D, and that's pretty much similar to the component actually in SketchUp, with making just an object copy. We just make a real new copy, and with linked, we're basically making a clone. So what I'm going to do is press Shift D, and then when you move your mouse, you see actually that you can move this object. So immediately after you make a copy, you get into the move command. And maybe that's not what we want. So I'm going to press Escape, and I still have that object copied. And it's got inserted right where the original object was. We just didn't move it. In the lower left corner, you see actually we have cube 0.001 selected. If I click here again, you see it will say cube 001, because these two objects overlap exactly the same space. So I can, for example, move this one by clicking on the red, the green, the blue, the green, and the red icon for the arrow. So you see that's actually the move command exactly along one axis. And you see also it shows you the direction, how you can move it with the red, green, or blue line. If you click on the white ring, you're actually moving it in 3D space along X, Y, Z at the same time. And that's not necessarily something you want to do, because by accident you might, let's say we move it to here. Let's take a look. And let's go back maybe to this view. Let's move it to there. So you see you're not really in full control of how objects move around. So that's the reason why mainly you want to move these objects with the arrow keys. So for example, down here you have transformation tools for rotate, and for example for scale, to scale along the X, the Y, and the Z axis. Properly, when you bring in objects from SketchUp, you might not necessarily really need to scale objects. We just maybe move them around, if even at all, because the idea is that in SketchUp you have everything set, and then we just bring it into Blender, and then we render it. But then there we have to position lights and all this stuff. But I'm doing this demo here simply to give you kind of like a basic understanding of how this system works. So those interface elements, the 3D widgets, are actually really nice, but most times I don't really use them besides actually the move command maybe, because you can move, rotate, and scale, and that also along X, Y, and Z, also with the shortcuts. So for example, let's start with move. I can press G, and you see now I can move this one freely around. And pay attention to the widget down here. You see X, Z, and Y, the directions. So if I press G and X, and you see it moves along the X, Y, and Z. You can also actually press G, and I don't click my mouse, I just move my mouse. So you see you're still inside that command. And then I could press Shift Z, and actually now I can move it along X and Y without the Z. Or for example, Shift X. So Y and Z without X. I can actually also tap R, and then actually it switches from move to rotate, or I could even press S, then it switches to scale. So you see it's actually pretty nice. Okay, so let's press R. So you see it's free rotation. If I press X, then it rotates around X, around if I press R and Y, around Y, and Z, around Z. And if I press S for scale, it scales in all directions at once. When I press Z, it only scales along Z, X along X, and Y along X. Well, okay. So that for like a basic introduction of how those objects can be moved around, rotated, and scaled. There's actually one last tiny thing that's really interesting to know. You also have something here called global and local. So, for example, I go to local. Now I press R and X, and I could type in 25. So I rotate this object 25 degrees. And you see now this widget actually is at an angle. And you see now I can move this one along its individual or personal z-axis, which is rotated by 25 degrees. So if I switch back to global, you see now this really goes up and down. And local. So it's actually pretty nice. If we press N for the property panel, you see on the right side it's popping up, and N makes it disappear. We also see this object is positioned at XYZ somewhere in space, and along X I have a rotation of 25 degrees. I can click on it, press 0, and then it resets actually that rotation. Okay. That, for example, for how to move, rotate, and scale objects. Now let's take a look at how we can select objects. So you can click and click. You see if I click on a new object, it deselects the previous. With Shift, I can add to the selection. Actually here, let's Shift D, escape, move it to the side. So click, Shift click, Shift click, Shift click. You see it actually has all those objects selected. If I click on this object now a second time, it deselects it. See that? Okay. You could also with B, for example, draw a big selection over it with the mouse. So left mouse button, click, drag, and then release the mouse button. Let's do this again. Click, drag, hold, release the left mouse button. And with the middle mouse button, so I press B, press and hold the middle mouse button, drag and release the middle mouse button, I can deselect from that selection. So you can either click individually on objects, or you can draw a selection over all objects. Okay. To deselect or select everything, here we have select, and you see deselect, select, it's A, inverse is also Control I. All you can do is just press A. I have some objects selected. If I press A, nothing will be selected. If I press A, everything will be selected. If I press A, nothing will be selected. So it's really nice that you just only have to memorize one button to do your select all or select nothing. So, and if you want to delete these objects, you can either press the delete key, or you can press simply X, and then you get a small pop-up asking you, do you really want to delete those? Yes, I want. So I click delete, and then everything got deleted. So I think at this point now we can maybe take a look at how we can add some objects. And before I do this, I would like to introduce you to this bullseye, or the 3D cursor as we call it. Because that one can be used for two things. On the one side, it can be used to scale or rotate around. It can also be used, or more or less, it is being used also as the insert marker for adding an object. And This insert marker can be changed with the right mouse button. So you have to be really careful when you want to add an object at a specific position. That maybe this 3D cursor isn't somewhere else outside your screen. So for example, now if I add an object, let's go to add, and maybe let's make a plane. See, there's the plane. If I right mouse button, click to there, add, mesh, and plane, there's the plane. So if I zoom around a little bit, there you can see the problem. So most of the time our scene obviously will be centered in our world center. So before you start adding something, maybe do this. I go into top view, right mouse button click, so it's centered in the top view. I go to side view, right mouse button click maybe a little bit in air. So when you have your architectural or your exhibit or your interior space and you want to add another object, maybe click close to the object, so when you insert a light, it, for example, by accident isn't inserted inside a wall or so. So for example here, if I click a plane, click there and add a plane, you see they're all pretty much above each other. So that's actually pretty nice. So very simple. Okay. And this 3D cursor we can actually also control. So if you press N and then you go to the 3D cursor, it tells you currently on the x-axis it's 4.5 inches, on y it's something, and z it's actually at 7.9 something feet. So for example here we could say, hey, I would like to add an object 9 feet above the ground, right at the center of my world. I can type in 009 and then add an object, and there you also see the object location is 00 and 9 feet. Perfect. Okay. I would like this plane actually to be on the ground, so I can press 0 so it's positioned on the ground. You also see that this object is 2 feet x and y. So it gives you the idea about dimensions as well. So as a quick doodle, let's maybe scale this object really big. So maybe I would like this rectangle to be, let's say 20 feet by 20 feet. And then let's add another cube, for example, and we say, well, maybe this cube should be z, maybe, let's say 6 feet, and y maybe 4 feet, and x, well, let's say this one is our wall, 8 inches. Now I would like actually to move this object down. To switch between shaded and wireframe, you can press the Z key on your keyboard, or you could use the Viewport shading menu and switch between solid and wireframe. Most of the time I just press Z, because your left hand is all the time over A, S, D, F, E, and R, and Z, and X, so it's very convenient. Okay, so I would like to move this one down. So I could move to there, zoom in a little bit more, and then I can press G and Z and try to get really close. Maybe actually I would like to be very precise with the position so that this one really sits actually on this plane, so I can turn on the snapping. The snapping we have down here, we can snap to the grid, to a point, to an edge, and a face. And maybe I turn on snap to edge, move this one up, and then that's the way how it works. I press G and Z because I just want to move this wall down onto my ground, and then go to on an edge I would like to snap to, and then I press Control. And then you see when your mouse gets close to geometry, it snaps to this edge. Let's go to a side, and there you see it snapped to that edge. Let's do this again from a side view. GZ, move it down, and then press Control, and sometimes Intuitive View, unfortunately, it flunks. So let's go into your 3D view, and then there it works. So what you notice actually, while I'm in perspective, I can easily snap to this one, and I don't really have to go into like a side view. So the snapping doesn't work very good in orthographics, but it works very often fantastic in perspective views. Okay, perfect. So maybe this is pretty big. Maybe let's make this one 4 feet, and then GZ and snap, move it down. Okay. Now I would like to add, for example, a light. So we can go to Add Lamp, and then we have different light types. Let me give you a quick introduction in how they work. So I select point, and then I move this point light a little bit to here. There. Okay. To get all the settings for the light, now we can go to our properties. So you see, based on what you click, you get a different set of options you could click at. Here's actually now the properties for the light. So I click on it, and then it tells me this lamp is a point light. That's the size. It casts a shadow. Just maybe you want to click on. I'm not explaining right now what this means. I will do that later in another video. And then you have the color, and we have the strength. Okay, so we would like to see how this light works. So what I'm going to do is I'm slicing my viewport a little bit, and I'm slicing my viewport one more time, and then this actually might be a good demonstration of why, for example, the different viewports are also really useful. Because now here I can see a side and a top view, and then here I have my 3D view. Because then when I start rendering and I would like to move the light around in those views here, I can easily perfectly position my light and then see the result here. So to start in this viewport to render, you see each of these viewports, they have their own individual layout and buttons, so they're separate from each other. So I go to here, click, and render it. And this is extremely bright. And I forgot something here. You don't have to do this. I have to do it because you don't have this preset. So there it is now dark. Now there's my light. So in the side view, actually, because this is orthographic, I can easily click on the white ring. And you see this way I can only move it up and down, left and right, but I can't really move it along, for example, the y-axis. And you see in the 3D view, when I move my light around, the further it goes away, the dimmer my scene will be, well, simply because the light energy falls off. So the math that's being used is kind of like close to the actual light physics. It tries to simulate how light works in reality as closely as possible, and making this render-wise, time-wise actually acceptable for us. So obviously this is not 100% physically correct, but it's pretty believable. If I go move it, for example, to the side, there you see, for example, now the shadow moves left and right. If I move this one above it, you see the shadow is below. If I move it very close, you see that the light is super bright. So for example, here now I could change my strength there. So you see it's not overshooting or overexposing everything. So, and as you can see, the point light basically works on, it shoots lights 360 degrees into all directions. We can, for example, change also the color. And let's keep this actually at white for the moment. Okay. Here we have a size, and this might be interesting to show. So the size we make really small, and you see you get super sharp edges. Because essentially from the small dot, the light is being shot out and then creates the shadow. If we make this one a little bit bigger, so it's now actually a pretty big light. So as you can see, we get softer shadows, and that's because maybe let's go to this view and quickly explain what's happening. So if we, for example, cast a shadow line like this, and there you see this is really, really sharp. Now this is actually a light with a size of 0. Now with a size of 10, actually we would have something like this. So maybe the light actually also starts from there, and maybe there, and there. And you see actually that there is a small space between the blue and the black line. And the black line is basically, or the blue line is basically full black, or full shadow, and the black line, and here's the outer edge. So you see they fan or the overlay a little bit. So that means actually in this area here, there's no light coming, but here a little bit of light can even touch the shadow, which actually turns into kind of like soft shadows. Okay, so that's for how, for example, this works. If we make this one really big, ooh, there like no shadow at all. And you also see the light source gets dimmer because you spread the amount of light energy over a bigger surface. Or 0 or 2 inch, we can also even type this in. Okay, so also you see with a point light, the shadows follow like perspective for shortening, so they're getting bigger the further away they are from the light source. And no, sorry, I mean the closer the light source to the object, the bigger the shadow, and the further the light source from the shadow casting object, the more parallel the shadow lines will get. So if we go to sun, everything will be super white because the sun here is very strong. So we can set this maybe to 2 or to 1. And you see actually it doesn't really matter even if I put my light under my scene or if I move it left and right. What's really important is basically this line, and that's the rotation. If I press N, you see it has no rotation, and if I press R, now I can rotate it. And there, look, there's a shadow. So you see basically that with the sun, you say, where is my sun? And from what direction does it emit light? In top view, I can also rotate it, so I change the direction of the shadow. And what's interesting to note about the sunlight, it simplifies our sun, so that basically we assume because the sun is so far away, we can maybe treat the sunlight rays as being parallel to each other, so we get parallel shadows. And you see also here it doesn't really matter where my object is, just a rotation and side view and top view is important. And then with this strength, we can set the amount of energy it shoots out. Okay. So sunlights, for example, can be used for when you have an interior scene and you want to have light from the outside shining through windows, because then those actually cast the correct shadows you're looking for. When we click on, oh wait, I forgot to say this, but also here we can trick around a little bit and artificially make those shadows softer and bigger with the size. But you want to keep them rather small. And this is also at one point kind of like your artistic freedom where you can play with. Let's go to Spotlight. And as it says, it creates a spot. So here now I'm going to override actually my rotation. I set this one back to 100. Then I move this one over. And there's my spotlight. And you see the way how this works. You have perspective for shortening shadows, and everything inside this cone is being illuminated. So if I rotate it this way. There, if I get closer or further. And spotlights are actually very useful when, for example, well, you would like to render, for example, recessed lights or small spotlights where you project a little bit of light onto a wall. So let's do a quick exercise here. I move this one to there. Let's go to side view, maybe a little bit to there. Move it closer, okay. And then Shift D and Y. Shift D and Y. And there you see it. This is actually maybe a good situation where I could show you now what the clone might mean. So I Shift D, move this one over, and then I change this one to 20 or 10. And you see this one light has a strength of 10. This light has a strength of 100. Now let's say you have an interior space and you have all these lights in the ceiling and you would like to, for the rendering, adjust the light energy. You really do not want to go light by light. That's going to be very painful. So in that case, you actually, when you know that the same wattage is being used, we can actually clone the lights. So let's go back to the main menu. So Shift D, make a duplicate object, and Alt D, make a clone. So I press Alt D and Y, Alt D and Y. Okay. So now it doesn't really matter what light I click. I click this one and say 20, and you see all lights are being adjusted at once. And that's because they are linked. They're kind of like components, like in SketchUp. So when you adjust one component, the change will be reflected to all other components because they all share the same, maybe you could say the same information about how this light is being set. We could even set all to point or spot or sun or area. So it changes not only just some of these settings, it can change the complete type. That's also true for the color. So you see that's actually a really nice feature, specifically when you have to work with many lights, in particular with recessed lights or in the ceiling. So I think we're close to the end actually of this lecture. Maybe there are two things I would like to show. When you work in one space and would like to increase the viewport, by the way, you can press and hold Shift and then press spacebar. Hold Shift and press spacebar, hold Shift and press spacebar. You see, kind of like with A, the same command always undoes the previous step. So this way you can easily switch between a small view, sorry, not a small view, make one view full screen and then go back to your layout, go to a different view, and you see it's really important where your mouse is. So that's very crucial that you pay attention to where your mouse is, because based on where it is and you click something on the keyboard, Blender will interpret it accordingly. You also have layers in Blender, and they're actually here. So those are 1 to 10, 11 to 20. Very small, very tiny. Maybe an interesting idea to just represent layers just as those clicks. But the nice thing is it doesn't really use up a lot of screen space. And at one point you develop your own method in how you separate all your elements. So I, for example, would like to have all my lights actually positioned on a different layer. So maybe on layer 2. So you could go to Object and then go to where is it? Move to layer. Or you could press M and then you get kind of like this dialog and then ask you, okay, what layer you would like it to move to. So you could press the number, or you could simply click on another icon, click, and it's gone. So there we see now actually there are two rings or circles inside those cubes. The one is orange, that means there are selected objects. The past object we had selected. There's my geometry. And you can add more layers to the visibility by either clicking on it, left mouse button, or shift click, and then you add, shift click, and you deselect visibility to it. See? Pretty nice. Very, very good. So I talked a little bit about like the different views, 713, etc. But well, for digital rendering later, we would like to have cameras. So maybe since we took a look at how we can add lights as a means to end this lecture, let's add a camera and then also position it and go to the correct view. So we can, inside this view, for example, go to Add, Camera, and then there's my camera. So you can see actually where it looks to and also where it faces to in terms of upwards. So I would like actually this camera to be kind of like here and then facing there. So I can move it to here. Let's go to the side view, maybe move it down, and then I have to rotate it. So I can press R and rotate it, and this should be perpendicular. So actually I can type in 90. If you press then a minus, you see you flip the positive or negative value. Press enter, and this way I rotated it. And then to go into the view, you can press 0. And this is actually now seen through the camera, and you see if I move my camera up and down, that's the way how this works. So why is this actually really nice and useful? Well, you know, when you later do interior architectural renderings, you want to save actually your views. So later when you have to go back and re-render a certain shot, you don't want to, in 3D space, try to find that position where you did a previous rendering. You just go to the camera and then switch to it. So I would like to switch to this camera, and that is actually Control 0 on your numpad. Or actually you can press also the 0 on your main keyboard. So you see this way you flip between the different cameras, and whatever camera is active, later if we would do an actual rendering, then that image would be rendered and saved into an image file. Okay, so I think this is pretty much a good cover of some of the basics for how to add lights, how to move the camera, and switch between, for example, rendering and shaded, wireframe mode, how to move objects between layers, etc. In the next video then we're going to take a look at how we can actually bring our SketchUp models into Blender.